unconstitutional, ungenerous, un-English, raged the famous London newspaper, The Times, in an editorial in 1844. But what was it that got the newspaper so upset? Well, the world's first great surveillance scandal had just exploded inside the halls of the British Parliament. Earlier that year, the famous Italian nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini, and you'll have to forgive me if I didn't pronounce that correctly, and a member of the British Parliament, Thomas Dunscombe, had started suspecting somebody was reading their letters to each other. So they were smart guys and they began planting small grains of poppy and little bits of sand to trap the spies. And it turned out they were right. Secret orders had been issued by the Home Secretary for Mazzini's post, saying that it be abstracted from the mailbags, taken to the inner room, opened and copied. They used to steam the letters and then steam the envelopes back again. The Times didn't like this. Even though Mazzini might, and I quote its editorial, be the most worthless and most vicious creature in the world, the Times argued, this is no reason in itself why his letters should be detained and opened. Last week, fresh evidence emerged that Israel's NSO corporation had sold India Pegasus surveillance technology. Technology that was being used to spy on political opponents and journalists. The media debate has largely centered around the intrusive abilities and potential abuse of Pegasus, which gives governments access to the private digital data of almost every citizen. A lot of you are probably asking yourself, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a terrorist, why should I worry about this? For all Indians though, there's a really big question here, which is the state's power to engage in surveillance against its own citizens. In most democracies, the exercise of that power needs judicial oversight and there is judicial redress. In India though, there's almost nothing of the kind. Like the United Kingdom learned more than a century and a half ago, the unchecked use of these powers to conduct what's called lawful interception constitutes a real threat to democracy. The power to intercept the digital communication of Indians, mobiles, computers, stored data, is assigned by the rules of the Information Technology Act to the Union Home Secretary or to the Home Secretaries of the various states and union territories. In certain situations, like an ongoing counter-terrorism operation, an Inspector General of Police or a Joint Secretary to the government may issue emergency orders to do this. A committee is in place to review these orders, but it has no judges on it. What that means basically is that the executive branch of government alone decides whether the case for conducting electronic surveillance is compelling, and it decides if the results justify continued use. The executive decides if and when disclosure to a judicial authority should take place. The executive, in other words, judges its own actions. Like India, many democracies understand there's a good reason for lawful surveillance, to protect us all against serious crimes. Few, though, provide the executive with such sweeping powers. The United Kingdom's laws allow the Secretary of State, the equivalent of India's Home Minister, to personally authorize 9 agencies to conduct lawful interception. But they also prescribe an elaborate system of safeguards, including an independent review tribunal, which includes judges and lawyers. The United States requires police to secure a warrant from a judge before conducting surveillance against any citizen, and that judge must subject the police's application to a very high threshold. France and Germany likewise require authorization from a magistrate. For generations now, Indians have known government's use of surveillance can end up subverting the values which bind us together as a republic. Drawing on colonial era practices and laws, governments have done all kinds of unlawful things. In 1963, the former police officer K.S. Subramaniam has recorded, the Intelligence Bureau ordered the Gujarat police to initiate wiretaps targeting the centre-right Swatantra Party. Gujarat's then Chief Minister Balwant Rai Mehta wasn't very happy about this and wrote to the Union Home Minister. He got a terse reply telling him that people who habitually oppose the policies of government must be spied on. Little documentation exists on domestic intelligence operations, but surveillance against political targets is believed to have expanded dramatically in the 1970s under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Following the emergency in 1975-77, the LP Singh Committee was set up to investigate allegations against the intelligence services. Its findings have never been made public, but they are believed to have acknowledged abuses took place. No one was held personally responsible though, nor any roadmap laid out for reform. The decades since have seen a procession of scandals. In 2013, even Defence Minister A.K. Antony's officials were alleged to have been subjected to electronic surveillance, perhaps by a rogue agency. In 2018, famously, evidence emerged that senior officials in the Central Bureau of Investigations had been wiretapping each other. Now, Union Home Minister Amit Shah was alleged, though never proved, to have ordered wiretaps against a Gujarat woman in 2013. Multiple states are believed to have done the same thing using specially purchased off-air interception systems. You don't need a lot of imagination to understand why so many different governments, so many different times have found this so seductive. The intelligence officers who used Pegasus against journalists probably knew that there was nothing of national security importance to be gathered from the exercise. In the event they did not, they'd have learnt so in short order. Instead, interception offers a tool with which to gather gossip on financial affairs, other kinds of affairs, personal grievances. In short, the stuff of character assassination and blackmail. And politicians love that stuff. The problem is compounded by the fact that neither of the two major intelligence services, the Intelligence Bureau and the Research and Analysis Wing, is governed by any legislation. As a result, the Intelligence Bureau has historically spent a large part of its resources on tasks with no conceivable national security bearing, like monitoring political parties or bureaucrats. Indeed, officers have perverse incentives to spend their time engaging in these activities to feed their politician consumers. Former Union Minister Manish Tiwari for several years sought to put a private members' bill seeking a legal framework for the intelligence services, noting that it would both ensure their accountability for abuses of power and also push them to focus their attention on core national security tasks. Even his own party, revealingly, showed very little interest. Ever since the time of the famous British Queen Anne, monarch from 1702 to 1714, the crown had enjoyed the right to intercept the communications of its subject. And the Mazzini scandal did very little to persuade it to give up its powers. In 1959, they had a scandal when the phone conversations of a lawyer and his client turned out to have been tapped. Again, in the 70s, there was a scandal. In 84, an antique dealer, James Malone, even moved court after it turned out police had accidentally been tapping his phone and the conversations ended up in the public domain. For decades, though, the United Kingdom's governments dug in their heels and did nothing until the European Court of Human Rights finally forced reform on the country's political class. In the 1960s, the United States National Security Agency spied on civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., the actress Jane Fonda, and even that writer of children's poetry, Benjamin Spock, all in a deluded hunt for traitors and subversives who didn't exist. A path-breaking congressional investigation of these abuses presciently warned that an intelligence service unregulated might turn its awesome technology against the domestic communications of ordinary citizens. Efforts to restrict interception technologies are a bit like railing against the tide. They're fated to failure. Nation-states have a legitimate interest in tearing the shroud off their enemies' secrets. Listening stations run by the Five Eyes Alliance, that's the US, the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, have sucked up and decrypted communication from across the world since the 1970s. Since 1993, we know from whistleblower testimony, there's an enormous system called Echelon that spied on friends and foes alike. Firms like Hacking Team, Finfisher, Zerodium offer much the same technology as NSO. So even if this one company is shut down, somebody else is going to be selling these services. And countries like China, the US, and the UK likely have their own in-house technologies. Technical evidence suggesting at least some of the evidence used in the Bhima Koregaon case was planted on suspects using a relatively crude and unsophisticated malware called NetWire shows what can happen and will happen when intelligence services are allowed to operate against their own citizens. They, like every other institution of government, must be bounded by the law and made accountable to it. This is Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor at ThePrint.